Bracketing is a simple process where we capture multiple images of the same scene but at different exposures. So we can capture darker exposures, brighter exposures and middle exposures so that in the final image we come out with a full range of light in the scene. What I mean by that is just at the top, at the end of this church, we have a really bright source of light. And if we capture one exposure, one normal exposure, which exposes for most of this scene, that window will be overexposed. And if we capture that same base exposure, we'll see that the chairs in the foreground will probably be underexposed because they're really dark. But if we can capture different exposures, first exposing for that window, exposing for the main scene, and exposing for the chairs, we can come out with a final image which has no overexposed or underexposed areas. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about auto bracketing and manual bracketing. Auto bracketing is where the camera does it for you. And if you want to go on Google, you can type in auto bracketing and your camera model to find out how to do it with your camera. I'm just going to demonstrate it here on the Nikon D800 and then a Canon 60D later on. Now, auto bracketing is the best way forward for me because it's really quick. If we have any moving objects, sometimes when we're using manual bracketing, we'll have to manually change the settings. And let's say the clouds are moving quickly. By the time we shoot the different exposures, the clouds will be in a different position. So most of the time, auto bracketing is the best option. And when I bracket, I like to bracket one stop apart between each exposure. So for example, if I'm going for a -3, 0 exposure and a +3 exposure, which is quite a wide range of light, I would usually go -3, -2, -1, 0, +1, +2, +3. So I come out with 7 brackets of the same scene. And that's what you can see on your computer screen right now. And the reason why I like to bracket one stop apart instead of 2 or 3 stops apart is because later on in post-processing, we'll have more options when it comes to deciding which exposures we'd like to use for the final image. So the more options we have, the better. Now let's actually talk about bracketing. So for the Nikon D800, we have a little sign here which says BKT. Now you'll have something different if you're using a different camera. And I can simply choose how many brackets I want. So this goes up to 9 brackets. I'm going to choose 7 here, and also the stops apart between the brackets. And with that set, I've already set up my camera and done everything I need to do. All I need to do is take my remote control, and I have it on bracketing here, and simply press OK. And with that done, I always look at my live view and review my images. So my brightest exposure has the shadows in the foreground nicely exposed for. We've got information there, and we can see that by the histogram too. And then if I scroll along, I'm going darker and darker, and I'll go to my darkest exposure, and I can see that the lights at the end in the large window at the back of the church are perfectly exposed for in my darkest exposure. And they're also quite well exposed for in my second darkest exposure. And this image that you see on your screen is the base exposure. So with those 7 exposures, we've managed to capture the entire dynamic range of light here. And this is a scene which actually has a huge amount of contrast, more than most, certainly more than most sunsets or sunrises. So it's not an easy one to shoot, but we can capture it still in just 7 stops of light difference. To take our understanding of auto bracketing a little bit further, when we're shooting low light situations, there's a very definite limit in what we can do with auto bracketing. And that's because our cameras can't shoot beyond 30-second shutter speed. But there's a very easy formula to work out when doing this. Now, for example, if you're shooting, say, 7 brackets and your 0 exposure is 5 seconds, it's a 5-second shutter speed. Well, to go 1 stop brighter, we need to multiply that, so that'll be 10 seconds. To go 1 stop brighter than that, we'll have to multiply that by 2 again, so that's 20 seconds. And when we get to the third stop higher, we have to multiply that again, and that's 40 seconds. But the camera will shut out at 30 seconds, so you won't get that full exposure. So when auto bracketing, when you're shooting 3 stops higher than your normal exposure, so you're shooting 7 brackets, make sure your 0 exposure is no higher than 4 seconds. A 4-second shutter speed. And that's because if we multiply that by 2, we get an 8-second shutter speed. That's 1 stop brighter. If we multiply that by 2 again, that's 16 seconds. And if we multiply that again by 2, that's 32 seconds. Now the camera will shut off after 30 seconds, but those last 2 seconds aren't too important. So let me demonstrate this. I'm going to turn my camera on and I'm going to bracket 7 exposures. I'm using f8. I have an ISO of 100 and my shutter speed is perfect at 4. And so I'm going to take the shots. And so now we have 7 fully developed brackets. Now if you're just going to shoot 5 brackets, we can put our zero exposure at 8 seconds. Because if we double that speed to make it 1 stop higher, that's 16 seconds. And if we double that speed again, it's 32 seconds again. So that's one limitation of auto bracketing and how to overcome it. Next, we're going to look at manual bracketing. So as you can see, auto bracketing is very simple. And again, please Google auto bracketing in your camera model and there'll be a load of tutorials which will show you how to do it. But the most important thing to remember is that we have covered our highlights in our darkest exposure, so that's visible. And in our brightest exposure, we have information in the darkest areas, like at the seats in the foreground here. That's the most important thing to remember. Now with manual exposure blending, it's actually really simple. All we do is affect the exposure compensation button. Now again, that's something you need to Google if you haven't already. So Google exposure compensation button and your camera model, and you'll find out how to do this. Essentially, all we're doing is changing what exposure we want to shoot in our camera. So for example, right now, I'm at 0 right now. I haven't used exposure compensation at all. So when I take a shot, I come out with this base exposure. And again, we can see it's nicely exposed for, but the chair's in the foreground, a little bit underexposed, and the light source at the back is overexposed. So now to manually bracket and to expose for the windows in the background, I simply use the exposure compensation button and I bring down the exposure level. And press OK. And now if we look at the preview and zoom into that highlight at the back, we can see that the window's still a little bit overexposed. So now all I do is use the exposure compensation again and go down. And now we've got a really dark exposure, and if we just zoom in, we can see that the windows have now been exposed for. And alternatively, if we change the exposure compensation, you'll see that now we have the chairs exposed for again. So all we're doing here is just telling the camera what level of exposure we want to shoot at. And we are just manually adjusting the exposure between frames. Now, as you can see, that is a little bit longer than doing auto bracketing. And for the vast majority of shots, I auto bracket. I've always got huge memory cards, 32 gigabytes and plenty of them, and I'm not scared to use them. I know some people are a little bit frugal when it comes to shooting. They don't like to use up the memory cards. But guys, sometimes you're in a scene and it's a once-in-a-lifetime sunset and sunrise. You need a lot of cards. Don't be frugal on that. And make sure you've got good quality memory cards too, like SanDisk Extreme Pro are very good. Now there is another way to bracket, and that's by using spot metering. But as I mentioned earlier, I only use matrix metering, and I don't think spot metering is a very effective way for bracketing. It takes a long time to move your spot on the screen, and I just don't find it as accurate as auto bracketing or manual bracketing. And of course, there's another way to manually bracket by going into manual mode and changing the shutter speed yourself, or the aperture, or the ISO, and that'll change the exposure for you. But it's long-winded. Very rarely do we need to do that. Most of the time, we can just auto bracket. And like I said, the most important thing is that we have the full range of light covered in the scene, preferably with each exposure just 1 stop apart. So after this, we'll talk about how I choose the exposures I want to work with in the final image. And usually I only work with 2 or 3, and we'll go into more detail about that later on. So just to continue with our bracketing tutorial, I want to show you how we can get around a limitation with cameras that only shoot 3 exposures at a time, because with the D800, we can shoot 9 exposures. So how do we shoot a wider range of brackets? Well, quite simply, if we just set up our brackets like we normally would, so let's say we've got our brackets set at 1 exposure apart. So I'm choosing a 0 exposure, a -1 and a +1 now. So I'm going to shut off my brackets, and then we can use our exposure compensation in our camera to fix that. Now with the Canon 60D, we simply slide this slider along, and you'll see that we're moving our brackets slightly. So before we were shooting -1, 0, +1. Now we're shooting 2, 3, and 4. Then when we finish shooting that, we can slide all the way along again and shoot -4, -3, -2. So very quickly, even though we have a limited range of brackets, we can overcome that just by using our exposure compensation function in our camera. We're essentially telling our camera what we want our base exposure to be. And by doing that, we're moving the brackets either side of that base exposure too.